if everything is simply tolerated, then you're standing for nothing. If you're standing for nothing, then the structures of your society are going to collapse. So again, it doesn't mean you're a hate-filled person or you're standing against, your enemies. You're standing athwart or against certain disvalues that are repugnant to the way you think a society ought to be rightly ordered.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. What is the role of religion in civic life? Should we impose our religious views on others? Must we bracket religion from the political sphere? Those are the questions we'll be debating today with Bishop Barron, and it's good, Bishop, to see you once again. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Brandon. Always a joy to talk to you.
Your latest foray was into the topic of synodality. You delivered a long paper on the topic of synodality, which Pope Francis has put front and center in the Church's mind at an annual conference of the Canon Law Society of America. Tell us how that went.
It was good. Yeah, they invited me, I think even before COVID. It's one of these things that got delayed. And they asked me to, look, I'm not a canon lawyer. I'm not trained in canon law. Now, as a bishop, I'm kind of drawn into the arena of canon law, willy-nilly, but I'm not trained in it. But they asked me to reflect theologically on synodality. So I wrote the paper last summer at some point, and I think it was well received. I talked about what it means for Pope Francis. So first part of the paper was just laying out how he's described synodality. Then I used three figures, namely John Henry Newman, Bernard Lonergan, and Augusto Del Noce, not to criticize the idea so much, but as to raise cautions about it, lest we go down certain alleys of bad interpretation. So call them critical engagements with the idea of synodality using those three figures. So that was talk. It was in Cleveland, and enjoyed being with all those canonists.
Well, today we're going to talk about the two subjects people say you should never talk about, namely religion and politics. But we're going to bring them together in this episode. This episode is going to be airing just before the midterm elections of 2022. So with politics on many people's minds, I thought we could discuss this supposed tension between religion and politics. So let's start at the highest level, and let me ask you this general question. What is the Church's role in civic society and in politics in particular?
Well, I think it plays a very important role, namely to bring a moral and spiritual dimension into the public conversation and the living out of our civic lives. Religion does not supplant politics. Think of John Paul II saying that, the priests should not be themselves running for elective office. The Church's role is not to be directly involved in political life in that sense. But it's to bring to bear, for sure, the spiritual and moral dimension of life so that it influences and affects the political conversation. What we don't want is famous, Richard John Newhouse's famous naked public square, a public square that's denuded of any connection to religion, morality, spirituality. That's not at all what the founding fathers of our country intended. It's not what has sustained our country at its best. So the role of religion is to be a kind of leaven for the political culture and to bring to bear this indispensably important dimension of life to that realm.
Often when the topics of religion and politics are mushed together, inevitably the conversation moves to considerations of tolerance or intolerance. Maureen Dowd, the well-known Catholic New York Times columnist, once claimed that since the word Catholic means all-embracing and inclusive, the Church's narrow-mindedness on certain social issues has become constricting, in her words. She argued, quote, "Absolute intolerance is a sign of uncertainty and panic. Why do you have to hunt down everyone unless you're weak? But what is the quality of a belief that exists simply because it's enforced? This is America. We don't hunt heresies here. We welcome them," end quote. What do you make of that claim? Go ahead.
The ironies are so thick there, that she's barely aware of how self-referential that remark is, as though she's a model of tolerance. I mean, give me a break. She has a completely rigid ideology, a liberal ideology in mind. Talk about hunting down, heretics, hunting down those that don't feel the same way she does. I mean, she's a very intolerant writer, it seems to me. So to play that game is just way too facile. Tolerance, Brandon. The Christian value is love, not tolerance. Love, it means willing the good of the other. And so, in that sense, we don't tolerate lots of things precisely in the name of love. I mean, we don't tolerate someone who's running around thieving and raping and murdering. We don't tolerate that in our society. We put an end to it out of a desire to protect those who are victims of it. That we would enforce certain laws. Of course, that gives structure and order and harmony to a society. That we are intolerant of lots of things in a civil society. Well, of course we are. Otherwise, the whole society would collapse. Think of any organized community. There are laws, and laws are imposed, not suggested. Laws are rigid and absolute. They're not vague suggestions. And the more we reverence a community, the more we plant it thick with laws. So I mean, those are very facile distinctions. And the whole heresy thing. That's a red herring to bring the issue of heresy into it. All reasonable people within a civil society are intolerant of certain things. To draw attention to that as some defining quality of the religious point of view is ridiculous.
In the past, you've often made a helpful distinction between tolerating people versus tolerating ideas. You've said that the church is always inclusive, but we should not confuse inclusiveness in regards to people with inclusiveness in regards to ideas. Say more about that distinction and how it particularly relates to politics.
Yeah, we love everybody. That means you will everyone's good, and that means you're kind and you're generous and you're not cruel and vindictive and hate-filled when it comes to human beings. We reach out always in an attitude of love. Jesus says, love even your enemies. So bless those who curse you. So yes, of course, love is always the right attitude. But that doesn't mean that I tolerate every point of view that you have, or that I thereby accept any action of yours. So I was just talking really earlier about actions. Certain actions are not tolerated at all. They're defended against by a civil society. And then see, ideas, when you say tolerate, you're treating the person holding the idea with love. But I would say what you do is now you argue with ideas that you don't agree with. You engage now in a rational form of discourse with those who hold ideas that you don't think are right. So it's not a violent approach, but rather it's an intelligent, respectful, but critical engagement of an issue. So that's why I've been saying for years, as you know, that we should recover the art of public argument, because we tend to fall into that binary. Either I'm blandly tolerant of every point of view, or I engage in aggression and violence. And I always suggested, no, there's a very happy middle ground called argument, which involves a deep respect of the person with whom you're arguing, always treating that person, no matter what, with love, but then being able to engage that person's ideas critically, but non-violently. And that seems to me is the right way to approach these questions. But what happens, go back to my mentor, Monsignor Sokolowski, philosophy is the art of making distinctions. Then we often, those distinctions get muddled. And so, well, if you want to love everybody, that means you should accept all their ideas. If you love everybody, well, let them be or do whatever they want. Well, no, that's not love, in fact, because love is willing the good of the other. Anyway, so keeping these distinctions clear, I think, is extremely important.
I want to continue the thread of that last thing you just said, where unless you agree with everything I believe, then you hate me. I found a lot of, especially younger people, I'm talking about people my own generation here, have a great difficulty separating their political views from their identity. And therefore, disagreement is equivalent to maligning my person. Do you see that as a special character of our age, that people find it hard to separate my ideas from who I am as a person?
Yeah, it's more exaggerated now, and we could look into that, like why that's the case, but I think it is more exaggerated now than it was. That again, we can't make a distinction between the person whom I love and the person whom I respect and the ideas that I don't, the ideas with which I argue. And if I were to say to you, no, no, you're wrong about that, I'm not attacking you. But see, people, they receive it that way now. They interpret that as a direct personal attack on my integrity. No, no, I'm just saying this idea that you hold is a dumb idea. And let me try to show you why. It doesn't mean that you're a dumb person or you're an unworthy person. So yeah, that's extremely important. But I don't know, maybe, I think it is harder today for people to make that distinction. And maybe it's, Brandon, the hyper sensitivity of so many today. If you want to get in the arena of argument, well, you got to have a somewhat thick skin, and you've got to maintain in your own mind that distinction. Well, is that person's attacking an idea that I'm holding? He or she is not attacking me necessarily. I can hate your idea and love you, but that's, I guess, trickier now than it was for people to keep that straight.
Here's my theory is that as people have lost their religious identity and their family identity, families are breaking down left and right, they're grasping for some place to root their identity. And for many people, it's become politics. Whereas before, if your most secure identity was rooted in the family and religion, if someone criticized your politics, it wouldn't be the end of the world because you're secure in who you are. But that's no longer the case for lots of people today.
Yeah, that strikes me as right.
Let's talk about intolerance more for a second here. I think anybody listening to this knows the rise of the so-called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are valorized in a hyper way in today's culture. And you might say the virtue undergirding all three of those is tolerance. So tolerance has become maybe the most celebrated virtue of our time. But you've written and spoken several times in the past about the need for a healthy sense of intolerance, that all communities, if they want to survive and flourish, have to be intolerant towards some ideas or proposals. Why is that the case?
Of course, because that's how the boundaries of a society are maintained. To set your face and set your back. If you say, here's what I'm for, well, then you're setting your face toward those values. That means you're setting your back against other things that you consider disvalues. If everything is simply tolerated, then you're standing for nothing. If you're standing for nothing, then the structures of your society are going to collapse. So again, it doesn't mean you're a hate-filled person or you're standing against your enemies. You're standing athwart or against certain disvalues that are repugnant to the way you think a society ought to be rightly ordered. Nothing in the world wrong with that. I think every healthy society involves that. I go back, Brandon, you're a lover of sports, as I am too, and sports, think of games, how structured by laws they are. I was watching I don't know when this will come up, but this couple nights ago, the Cleveland now Guardians against the Yankees. And I love baseball. I played since I was a little kid. And man, the number of rules that govern baseball and people that love baseball love those rules because they know it makes the game better. It makes the game more integral. And if the rules are abrogated, then the game is going to collapse in short order. So and the role of the umpires in the postseason games, you have more umpires on the field because you want to be super clear about who's out, who's safe, what's fair, what's foul, etc. There was a play I watched last night where the first baseman had a long stretch to get the ball, and he was pulled off the bag, and it was a bang play, and the throw beat the runner for sure, but the foot was off the bag, and the camera showed it from like 18 different angles just so we could see. But what that was a kind of exulting in the rules of the game. That, okay, I know it was bang play and the throw reached the base first, but his foot was off the bag, which means he's safe. And then they were putting the camera on the umpire and then praising the umpire, of what a great umpire he is and what a good call that was. But that's baseball people. We love laws, Don't get me started on golf. The way golf is structured by law and custom and orderliness. And so the same is true in a civil society is, I tolerate everything. Well, then you won't play golf at all. You'll never play baseball with that attitude, and you won't be able to live well in a civil society. So that's another distinction that's key to make.
Let's get back to religion and its role in politics. You often hear people today say, you should not force your religious views on others. Many of them will reference this famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, speech that John F. Kennedy gave in 1960 to a group of Protestant
Hmm.
pastors in Houston, in which he dreamed of an America, quote, in which no religious body seeks to impose its will, either directly or indirectly, on the general populace, end quote. What should Catholics make of that vision? Is there a problem with religious people seeking to impose their will on the general populace?
You got to make distinctions again. Let's say between the moral dimension of a religious point of view, and let's say the properly cultic or liturgical side of religion. Would it be right, like, even if we had a devoutly Catholic president, let's say 80% of the Supreme Court was Catholic, let's say that both houses of Congress were dominated by very devout Catholics, would it be right for me, for example, to advocate for a law requiring everyone in this country to go to Mass? Well, no. I think even with all of that, governmental support, we would say no. That would be a illegitimate use. That would be a kind of imposition. Indeed, it would undermine what John Paul II identified as the really first and most basic of the freedoms, religious liberty. That you can't be compelled by law, let's say, to worship God in this particular way. Now, having said that, is there a dimension of religion properly moral that's not dependent so much on a particular revelation, but is a function of our rational sensibility, that we thinking things through together can clearly identify certain things as immoral. So, for example, we have clear laws against murder. Well, those coincide with one of the Ten Commandments. We have laws against rape. They coincide with one of the Ten Commandments. We have laws against thieving, et cetera, et cetera. So, am I willing to impose those on the society? Well, sure, because we have laws against those things. All law involves an imposition, and people can forget that point too, as though like I'm somehow uniquely imposing myself if I'm a religious person. Well, no. Anytime you formulate a law, you're imposing something. You're saying, I want all of you to drive, 65 miles an hour. That's the speed limit by law. I'm not suggesting it. I'm imposing that on the whole society. Well, the same is true of laws against thieving and against rape and against murder and so on. So there's that side of the issue, the properly moral side of religion, where I think that can and should be imposed. Other dimensions of religion that are more dependent on a direct revelation and are more a matter of private determination, I think those oughtn't to be imposed by law. Now, is there a kind of murky middle ground? Yeah, and that's why we debate this thing a lot. I think of someone like Sohrab Ahmari and our friends on the integralist side of the equation, who harken back to, I remember them vaguely when I was a kid, blue laws. There were laws in our country that were meant to inculcate a respect for the Sabbath day. So that Sunday, things by law were closed and the society by law was different on Sunday. That changed in my lifetime. Now Sunday is just like another Saturday. Is the worship of God such a basic good, and can reason determine that I could say, yeah, I think a law regarding the worship of God should be established? Well, now people of goodwill can debate that point, but it's hinging on that distinction between the more kind of private and the more public side of religion.
Let me ask about another objection that Catholics often hear from their non-religious friends and family, namely the so-called separation between church and state.
Yeah.
People will say, well, look, the Constitution was set up in a way to prevent religious people from imposing their views on others through the political process. How do you understand this separation? What does it mean? What does it not mean?
Well, famously, the wall of separation is not in the Declaration or the Constitution. It's in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. What he meant by it, we can debate that, but it's not in the formal documents of our country. What we do have, it's in the First Amendment. In fact, the opening words of the First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Now, see, we forget, Brandon, what that means because it's so alien to our experience, but not to that of the founders. They knew about a society, namely their own, in which there was an established religion, namely Anglicanism. It was the establishment religion. Uh, Go now a century later, and John Henry Newman, when he becomes a Catholic, and now runs afoul of this established religion, and he knew what that meant for him. The founders didn't want that. They didn't want the government formally to establish one religion as the official religion of the country. Now, may I say this? That was designed, that was to protect religious people from the aggressiveness of the government. So I'm a Roman Catholic. I'm back in the 18th century, and you tell me now we've got an established religion, which is Anglicanism, which means I'm excluded thereby from all sorts of different expressions of public life, which was the case in England up until Newman's time. I think the First Amendment, it's not protecting the government from religion. It's protecting religion from the government, from the aggressiveness of the government. Now, look at the second part, the so-called free exercise clause. So Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, and it will respect the free exercise of religion. Again, protecting religion from the aggressiveness of the state. The state should not be limiting people's religious expression. I think both clauses of the First Amendment there are protecting religion from the government, not vice versa. But we tend to construe, see, Jefferson's language of the wall of separation as somehow protecting the civil society from religion. I think it makes a much more plausible case that it's the contrary.
Well, let me close with this question. Again, we're recording this just before the midterm elections. Voting is on the minds of lots of Catholics. How should an individual Catholic shape their political views, and how should they vote? Is there one single Catholic position or Catholic party or Catholic way to vote? What would you recommend as a bishop?
I'd recommend reading Catholic social teaching if you want to get the whole picture, beginning from Leo the 13th, coming up through Pope Francis, this wonderful tradition of texts on political and economic questions. Or read the summary statements that have come out of the Vatican and indeed out of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. So Faithful Citizenship is a good summary of Catholic social teaching. I've said it 1,000 times, many others have as well, that Catholic social teaching does not fit into either of our political parties, doesn't fit neatly into them. There are elements within the Republican platform that are deeply congruent with the Catholic view, as the Democratic platform. Other elements deeply incongruent. So therefore, you've got to make a judgment in conscience. You have to survey that. You have to look at the issues that are most of liveliest concern. You've got to look at the levels of threat, I would say, to human life. Where's human life and the dignity of human life most threatened? And I think you have to stand athwart those things. Now, the church is always very careful not to say, oh, therefore you must vote Democratic or therefore you must vote Republican. It has never done that, and it shouldn't. But it should leave it now to the conscience of the voter, having surveyed all the relevant issues, having looked at Catholic social teaching, having, I would say, given a priority to those issues where human life is most directly threatened. Having made all those moves, now in conscience, you make a judgment. But I think it's a very high responsibility within our democracy, and I say as a Catholic, a high responsibility to vote and to enter into that process.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you have something you'd like to ask Bishop Barron, send in your question by visiting the website askbishopbarron.com. Today, we have a question from a high school theology teacher in Houston, Texas, asking for Bishop Barron's advice on how to explain a difficult topic to his students. Here's his question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Reed Linton, and I'm a high school Catholic theology teacher in Houston, Texas. Recently, I was teaching on the Eucharist, specifically on transubstantiation, and, like it is almost every year, students can be confused by the terms accidents and substance. How do you recommend that I teach on these two terms, specifically on the notion of substance to today's modern audience? Thank you very much. God bless.
Good. That's very helpful. And I think distinctions in order. We don't want to tie that language too much to the Aristotelian sort of physics and philosophy out of which it comes. So that does indeed affect the church's understanding, and Thomas Aquinas certainly would have inherited that language. But Thomas speaks, as one of my professors put it one time, a fractured Aristotelese. He doesn't simply take in Aristotle. I think the best way to do it is to distinguish between appearance and reality. So accident means appearance. The appearances of the bread and wine remain unchanged, even as the substance, call it the deepest or core reality, changes. So accident means appearance. Substance means deepest and core reality. One way to test it, what are we dealing with after the consecration? Correct answer, we're not dealing with bread and wine anymore. We're dealing with the body and blood of Christ, though the appearances of bread and wine remain unchanged. So I would make simply that distinction. I would also add this, if that sounds peculiar. We distinguish all the time between appearance and reality. Often appearance and reality simply coincide, but very often they don't. Look up into the night sky. Are you looking at the stars that are there or stars that were there? Because it's taken light so long to get to our eyes. You're seeing what was the case. You put the stick in the was it glass of water in front of me. Put a stick in the water, and well, that stick is bent. Well, no, I know it looks that way, but it really isn't. Or you meet somebody and you get a first impression, and you say that guy is just a jerk. But then someone else who knows him much better says, no, I know he might look that way sometimes, but he really isn't. My point there is that we make that distinction all the time between appearance and reality. So in regard to the Eucharist, yeah, it appears to be bread and wine, but because of the power of Christ's word, its core reality has changed. Maybe try it that way.
Well, thanks, Reed, for your question, and thanks to all of you for watching and listening. It's another Word on Fire show episode, which means another new book from Word on Fire. I feel like we're announcing new books at every episode, and this time, the new book is a children's book. It's called Light of the Saints. It just came out through Word on Fire. It's an interactive children's book that tells the story of 12 extraordinary saints from all around the world. But the unique feature is that it's a shine the light book, meaning it has features that are activated by shining a flashlight or your cell phone light through the pages. When you shine the light, it reveals different images and features. So check it out. You can find it at wordonfire.org/light, wordonfire.org/light. And again, the book is titled Light of the Saints. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.